avec les différentes organisations de la société civile pour déposer un mémorandum adressé au président de la République afin de lui demander le retrait des bases militaires françaises et de toute force d'occupation militaire étrangère du Sénégal. Nous estimons que pour les questions de souveraineté militaire notamment, ces bases militaires ne doivent pas être présentes sur nos territoires. Nous rappelons au président Bassirou Diomaye Faye qu'il a été élu pour des raisons de rupture. Et cette rupture, notamment, c'est une rupture contre l'impérialisme occidental. Et aujourd'hui, les bases militaires françaises sont un des éléments les plus manifestes de cet impérialisme dans nos États. C'est pourquoi alors, nous exigeons le retrait de ces bases militaires sur nos territoires dans les plus brefs délais.
Donc, c'est les raisons pour lesquelles nous sommes là, en tant que les organisations panafricanistes du Sénégal, qui, voilà, pour déposer ce mémorandum, parce que ce gouvernement qui est là se dit panafricaniste, et nous disons tout panafricaniste doit en tout cas veiller à la souveraineté du continent africain, que ce soit sur le plan militaire, sur le plan économique, mais aussi sur le plan politique.
Is Senegal betraying the AES? Is their new leader too friendly with France? We'll explore that and much more. Welcome to This Week in Africa, the collaborative effort between Authentic Africa and African Stream, where we break down this week's breaking news and its impact on Pan-Africanism and Africa's independence. Today, we delve into the political landscape of Senegal's post-election, the spotlight on its president, Faye, who ascended to power with the backing of a youth-driven anti-imperialist movement originally championed by Sonko. Sonko was among the youth favorites and working class, and his strong stance against the French imperialism shifted his campaign focus toward broader democratic reforms, subsequently endorsing Faye after being banned from the elections. However, recently questions have been arising about the new administration's fidelity to its anti-imperialist roots. Faye's initial diplomatic engagement included meetings with several pro-Western African leaders and a notably controversial visit to France to meet with President Emmanuel Macron before connecting with the anti-imperialist bloc, including President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. So this episode explores whether these actions signal a departure from the campaign's original anti-imperialist promises or a strategic approach to international diplomacy. So tune in as we unpack these developments and invite you all to share your perspectives on Senegal's political direction under its youngest president. Before we get into today's stories, I'd like to start off with some introductions. I'll turn it over to my co-host, and then I will introduce myself.
Greetings. I'm happy to be back on. My name is Inem. You can call me Inem. I'm a journalist with African Stream. I am also a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, aka the AAPRP. And I am one of the co-founders of the Thomas Sankara Center for African Liberation and Unity, which is based in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. And that's where I'm based. So I am reporting to you from Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. And I'm happy to be back on and to talk about this because I think this is going to be a very, very interesting topic.
Absolutely, lots to cover. And my name is Joe Hatagwa. I am an American-born Sierra Leonean, founder of the social media pages under the name Authentic African. Our goal is to help connect the diaspora and Africans living on the continent. We do everything from helping people move, visit, and invest in buying land on the continent of Africa. And of course, we do this weekly live stream as a collaborative effort with African Stream. So with that, we will just jump right into the first story. So as you guys all saw, Senegalese organizers from dozens of Pan-African groups demanded that newly elected President Faye expel the French military from Senegalese soil. A few days later, on July 14th, so that was a little over a month ago, he said to media, "I do not think that there is a need today, whoever the partner may be, to go in the direction of brutal ruptures." So this is a significant blow to Pan-Africanists as Faye's young working class base. So while there was initially much hope that the new president would join his revolutionary neighbors, the Alliance of Sahelian States or the AES Confederation, he did visit a more conservative neo-colonial governments of Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and Ghana to meet with their presidents in his first few months in office. Then the 44-year-old's first visit outside of the African continent occurred in Paris, where he met with French President Emmanuel Macron. There was also some recent discussions, which we can talk about a bit. And when he finally did make his way to Burkina Faso, he did so to ask President Ibrahim Traoré to abandon the AES project and rejoin the Economic Community of West African States, otherwise known as ECOWAS. And so the organizations behind the recent memorandum addressed to Faye included the urgencies of Pan-Africanists and Africa First, which is another group as well, and a few others. And so I'd love to get your thoughts on that initial video that we played and what people are saying on the ground, because as someone in Burkina Faso, you have mentioned on many occasions how politically aware folks are on the ground there. What have you been seeing and hearing about the direction that the new president of Senegal has been going in, and how people feel in the AES?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think this is going to be very interesting conversation. And it's an interesting topic because there's still a level of debate around Diomaye Faye, as well as Ousmane Sonko, who is the Prime Minister of Senegal currently. And Sonko was the one who propelled Diomaye Faye to power. But I will say that there's definitely a growing widespread discontent with Diomaye Faye across the West Africa region among the people, and particularly in the Alliance of Sahel states, but even among a lot of the working class people of Senegal. I think Senegal is a very, very interesting country. And there's a lot of history that I also want to touch on that explains, in my opinion, what's going on right now with Diomaye Faye and with Sonko to some extent. But, I guess to bring things to the most immediate context, there was a lot of hope that Diomaye Faye would be a staunchly anti-imperialist president. And that's largely because Ousmane Sonko, who rose to prominence around 2018, 2019, and he contested in the last election prior to this one, so about 5 years ago, running against Macky Sall, and he placed third, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong, but he wasn't one of the top two finalists. But Sonko had this staunchly anti-imperialist reputation that was tied to, for one, him being a whistleblower who exposed certain forms of corruption within Senegal's government, but also taking a position against things like the CFA franc neo-colonial currency. But over the years, he didn't win that election. Macky Sall won that election, at least as far as we know. Macky Sall won the election. These kinds of things, or there's debate, it's contested into whether or not that was legitimate. But as far as the results that the public was given, Macky Sall won. And there's kind of an interesting struggle that revolved around getting Ousmane Sonko into power in Senegal. And it's kind of interesting how that evolved. I keep using the word interesting. I'll try to think of some other words to throw in there, but I do think it's fascinating how things evolved and what Senegal's sort of political landscape looks like. Because Senegal is a place where I feel like there is very, very strong ideological divergences along class lines. So the vast majority of Senegalese people and workers actually do have a very strong anti-imperialist consciousness, in my experience. I was in Senegal. It's been a few years now, but I did study in Senegal at one point, and I connected with the Front for an Anti-Imperialist Popular and Pan-African Revolution, known as FRAP, and they were leading this mass movement called France Dégage, which is like France, get out of here. And one of the things that I really took in was the fact that a lot of regular, like working class, like day-to-day people that you'd meet on the street actually do have a very, very strong analysis and understanding of imperialism and the imperialist system. But then Senegal also has this very, very like pro-French petit bourgeoisie class, this like middleman class. They're not quite the ones who call the shots in the global capitalist system, but they do have some serious stakes in it, and they do defend, neocolonialism. And so there's like this class division, and we see, of course, class divide across the continent. But I think that Senegal just has very sharp ideological divisions on those lines, where the working class actually has a very strong like anti-imperialist consciousness and anti-imperialist awareness that's even more heightened compared to like some other countries. And then the very, 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 very pro-French petit bourgeois class or like neo-colonial class that just has this very, very strong, stark differences in terms of how they view things. So with all this being said, I think that because of the way Senegal has this very, very pro-French elite class, and they were kind of able to shift a little bit of the focus of the Senegalese workers over the past few years. So the beginning of the struggle around Sonko and Diomaye Faye was very, very focused on this idea of overthrowing French imperialism. And that was like the basis of Ousmane Sonko's campaign at the beginning. It was very tied to this let me use the word like France dégage movement, this France get out of here movement. Like that was what backed him at the beginning and like gave Sonko like a major push to prominence. And it was around, again, these questions of the currency, this and that. But with time and this influence from Senegal's elite, the focus really began to shift towards one where it's like we need to protect Senegal's bourgeois democracy. So there's this kind of narrative that does exist in Senegal that I think is pushed very hard from this particular class that I'm talking about, around how Senegal is like, as far as I can remember, the only, if not one of the very, very few West African countries that's never had a coup d'etat. So that kind of creates a military coup d'etat. So it kind of creates a difference between like Senegal and the rest of the Sahel. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are all countries that currently have quote unquote coup governments, but the revolutions in those three countries came through the military. And Senegal has kind of this, to some extent, a national identity that is somewhat rooted in the fact that they're a bit an exception within West Africa and within the Sahel, having never had a military coup. Some people would argue that Senegal had something of a soft coup against the Mali Federation, which was this historical attempt to unify Mali and Senegal under one Pan-African state. And, the first president of Senegal, Léopold Sédar Senghor, kind of sabotaged it. And some people call that a soft coup who critique it. But this military kind of relationship military power has never, taken hold of Senegal. And so a lot of the focus leading up to this period of Diomaye Faye coming to power began to be very focused on these questions of democracy in this very narrow sense, like this very narrow, like we want to preserve our electoral democracy. We want to have, I would use the term bourgeois democracy, intact. We don't want to be like those countries that have had coups. And then the kind of the strong anti-imperialist dimension kind of started to fade into the background. So even before Diomaye Faye came to power, I think that there were some concerns in the way a lot of the campaign focus had begun to slowly shift, and the anti-imperialist aspects became a little quieter. With that said, there were still certain expectations. There's so much I can say. I know we have a lot of videos, but I guess another thing I'll just add really quick before we get into other stuff. I mean, there's so much I can touch on. The bar has shifted. In 2018, when Sonko was becoming a prominent anti-imperialist figure in the region, a lot of the focus was on the CFA franc currency, which is a currency that France controls. So France controls the currency of 14, technically 15 if we include Comoros, African countries. They're able to basically manipulate African states on this economic basis because they have voting power and in a way like a sort of de facto veto power within West and Central African banks. And they're able to determine the value of these currencies. The reserves are held in France. And Sonko was campaigning against that as he was, first emerging as a candidate. But the bar has kind of shifted now. We're in a place where 3 other countries have completely booted the French militaries from their soil and closed those French military bases and are also talking about developing a sovereign currency. But I think the AES has shifted the scale so much further than where Sonko was, even when he was emerging, that it's like the bar is a lot higher. So for him, and Faye, and I want to be clear, like Faye is the president. Sonko, I think, does call a lot of the shots. He's the one who recently said, come out and vote for Diomaye Faye, and people did on his word. But, the bar is not where it was when these people were just emerging, Sonko specifically. A lot of what was considered like very anti-imperialist in 2018 isn't really given that same weight, given the context of 3 countries that have taken anti-imperialism to a much further extent. And so for now Faye to be saying very explicitly, we're not going to join the alliance of Sahel states, I mean, that's a massive blow for a lot of people, because the point of wanting to support an anti-imperialist candidate in the region would be to strengthen this pan-African anti-imperialist bloc that is trying to become, a unified state. So for them to say blatantly, like, we're not going to do it, that's a serious blow. It's like that is become kind of the bar. That's the litmus test now, right? Like, you have one job as an anti-imperialist, and that is to, join this anti-imperialist confederation. And then just final point, because you did already bring it up, though I know it might come up later. I also think it's just very important when we have new presidents and politicians coming into power, we need to look at who are those, like, where are those first places that they go to establish relationships. I think your first international visits really do indicate something of your politic. So, for example, the first visits of Traoré was to go, to places like to go to Mali, right? The first visit in Africa for Assimi Goïta was to go to Burkina Faso. Their first visits outside of Africa were to go to Russia. But when we look at someone like Bassirou Diomaye Faye, his first visits in the region were to places like Ghana, Nigeria, and Cote d'Ivoire. So he visited those 3 countries first. These are some of the most pro-Western countries, government-wise, pro-Western governments in the region. And those were the first contacts that he went to visit. And I'll get into some more details about his Nigeria visit later. And then his very first international visit is to go directly to France. And so I think these are all signs, in terms of what Bassirou Diomaye Faye's politic was. Okay, and then I'll stop there because I know we have a couple other videos. I have so much more to say, but I think that, we can get into it with some other context.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to correct my pronunciation. It is Diomaye Faye, and I was saying Faye earlier, so apologies. So those of you who might be confused by who I was referring to Diomaye Faye and Sonko earlier. And I will mention, this is an anecdote, but I did have a Senegalese American national Uber driver just yesterday going from a place to another, and he felt very disappointed by everything we just talked about, right? He had been hearing about the protest, he saw the response from Diomaye Faye, and I think he was someone who was under the impression that Senegal was going to be joining the AES. And then I had another conversation, also anecdotal, with someone who now is an American citizen, and the way he described it is in the same way that Diomaye Faye had described it in his response, and it was along the lines of, and so I guess what you're talking about is the differences in classes. This guy was a more well-to-do business and gentleman, and he mentioned, it's really hard to just, rip away from the imperialists. They have their claws in everything. You can't just completely remove them in one fell swoop. In his mind, he said, sometimes you have to work within the confines of the system because they have the leverage and Africans don't. And that was the way he perceived it. And I thought it was interesting to hear those 2 different viewpoints, and both of which I think are aligned in what they want the outcome to be. But it sounds as if there are differences in opinion as to how Diomaye Faye has been performing. And of course, I'm seeing that in some of the comments here as well. And so to move on to the next story, the first video we showed was from protests in early July. There have been further discussions, and there's been more coming out of Senegal, and the demand for Ukraine and France expulsion even more recently. So the Pan-Africanists of Senegal have had enough. They want both Ukraine and France now. Ukraine, of course, is because of what we've seen recently in Mali. They want them out of the country, and they're moving toward that with a newly launched alliance of several Pan-African groups under the banner of the Front for the Removal of French Military Bases. So during a rally on the 22nd of August, so a little over a week and a half ago, the Front demanded the expulsion of French military bases, and it also called for the expulsion of Ukraine's ambassador. This was in light of the Ukrainian ambassador reportedly posting a comment video on his Facebook page that supported a terrorist attack against Malian army, and as well, Ukrainian military intelligence spokesperson publicly declaring on television that Ukraine aided separatists in northern Mali. So Senegalese President Diomaye Faye came to power in April on an anti-imperialist wave of support. So many hope that the West African country would follow in the steps of its Sahelian neighbors, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. The three countries expelled French military, as you guys know, we've reported on that recently, and united under the banner of the AES. The new anti-imperialist confederation shares a policy on defense, economics, and foreign affairs, and seeks to unify Africa. However, concern is growing in the region that Diomaye Faye recently declared that he does not believe in the immediate ruptures with the country when asked about expelling the French. He also stated that Senegal will not join the AES, but hopes it will consider reuniting with the Economic Community of West African States. So again, more aligning with the ECOWAS as opposed to aligning with AES in terms of his rhetoric and what it potentially looks like in terms of his actions as well. So let's go to a video and we will have some commentary on the other side.
Considérons que c'est un terroriste, cet ambassadeur. Vous devez tous expulser du Sénégal.
Hier, on était devant l'ambassade ukrainienne pour manifester notre mécontentement par rapport à l'ambassadeur d'Ukraine qui a manifesté sa participation pour aider des terroristes qui ont attaqué nos frères maliens. Nous, le message qu'on voulait faire passer, c'était de faire savoir au monde entier et à nos frères maliens que le Sénégal est derrière eux. Nous sommes des panafricains. On combattra pour la liberté de l'Afrique. Tant qu'on n'a pas gain de cause, on ne s'arrêtera jamais. Maintenant, le message est très clair pour nos autorités sénégalais et pour tous les frères africains, pour leur faire savoir qu'il y a un front qui a été créé, et ce front, c'est pour le retrait des bases militaires, c'est aussi pour le retrait de tous les impérialistes qui sont ici au Sénégal.
So we've reported on this twice now. I think we've spoken about this at length. So for those of you who aren't aware of what what the Ukraine has done in Mali, they basically said the quiet part out loud more than once, and we've reported on it. So if you guys want to hear more about those particular stories, you can go back and check out some of our previous live streams. But it was egregious, right? I mean, them basically giving intelligence to a militant group. I think you call them death squads, right? Giving intelligence to those folks that end up causing loss of life from Malian soldiers, and their explanation is that it was Russian soldiers that were on the soil there. So that's who they were going after. In any case, these militant groups ended up causing loss of life with the Malian military. You know, do you think, based on Diomaye Faye and Sonko's rhetoric now, and as you mentioned toward the end of their campaigning, that they really will be willing to expel France or the Ukraine, considering the knowledge that they have? I know that Senegal had recently said that they wanted to have an immediate meeting with the ambassador to the Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken. But a meeting is one thing, expulsion is another. So I'd love to get your thoughts, Inem, on what you think based on what you've seen so far.
I mean, on the question of France is a little bit easier to answer. Diomaye Faye said there will be no immediate ruptures. Last week on Thursday, he met with the Prime Minister of Spain and basically said that he wants to see even more European collaboration with the Sahel in the fight against terrorism. So as we see Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger actually creating these ruptures with Western military, occupation, we see at the same time Diomaye Faye actually begging, or at least requesting even more Western military intervention, explicitly stating that he wants to see Europe intervene even more in the Sahel, have even more military relationship with the Sahel. So we see, I think the question of whether or not he's going to cut ties with France, to me, it seems quite evident that at this juncture, he won't. Ukraine, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that he will really cut ties with Ukraine. I think, it's like Senegal is trying to play this very like in-between role where they've been trying to approach things strategically by being friendly to the AES while still ultimately betraying the interest of the anti-imperialist struggle, refusing to join the AES, aligning with ECOWAS and trying to be like, we're nice to you though, and we would like you to come back. And like, why won't you come back if we treat you nice? Even though they're not, Diomaye Faye is not actually delinking with the West, still a part of ECOWAS, still, French military is remaining in the country. We had a comment that was like, why aren't Senegalese people speaking out about this? But I think that's what these past two videos are showing, that there are movements. There is like a struggle in Senegal that is being waged right now. They just created this new front for the removal of French military bases, explicitly in response to Diomaye Faye stating that there will be no rupture with the French military. So I think we are seeing Senegalese people now who are coming out on the streets, organizing, in a collective, well-organized movement trying to fight against this. I mean, there's so much I can say, but I do feel like some of this context is helpful. Senegal is a very different country from the other Sahel countries. And there's a history of Senegal that's very, I think, important to give context here. And I think Senegal is just very unique in the sense that, again, I think the ideological divisions on these class lines are so pronounced and so obvious. If we think about Senegal's history, Senegal was the capital of the French colonial empire in West and Central Africa. So like the main station for the French colonial administration was in Senegal, and it was from Senegal that they did like all of their colonial work in the rest of West Africa and even in Central Africa. Senegal was the only African country, at least south of the Sahara, if we're going to make that division. But at least I know within West and Central Africa, Senegal was the only African country where a tiny sector of the population during the colonial period was able to legally declare itself evolved, meaning, French. Basically, they could legally file themselves as Frenchmen if they denounced their African heritage. Not all of Senegal. There were 4 places in Senegal, specifically Dakar, Rufisque, which is a suburb of Dakar, Saint-Louis, which was like at one point the colonial capital, a very like French stronghold, and l'île de Gorée, so Gorée Island. Those 4 places, there was a small minority that was able to become quote unquote legally French if they denounced their African heritage. At the same time, Senegal has actually a pretty pronounced, like pretty clear anti-imperialist history of struggle. There's a lot of Senegalese Pan-Africanists that you could cite as a reference. I think Cheikh Anta Diop is one of the more well-known ones, but he struggled against the first president, Léopold Sédar Senghor, who was very pro-French, very, very pro-French. I think there's a lot of ideas about how Senegal was founded, but Senghor was staunchly pro-French in his politic, and people like Cheikh Anta Diop fought against this. Omar Blondin Diop was a youth from Senegal who was killed by the Senghor administration allegedly. There's still a lot of questions about trying to open up what happened to him in terms of this being a political assassination. There's so many other, Sembène Ousmane, the filmmaker and the novelist, again, somebody who struggled against this pro-French line, and he had a lot of his works banned. One of the first Pan-Africanist communists on the continent was Lamine Senghor, not Léopold Senghor, Lamine Senghor, who comes from Senegal. So I think there's always been this strong class division where there's this small minority in Senegal that's like, they have been conditioned to think of themselves as French people. And yes, Omar Blondin Diop, so I mentioned him as well, but this is the name of the person who was a political prisoner who was, potentially or allegedly assassinated, killed in prison during the Senghor era. So there's this strong level of class struggle in the country that goes back, where we have a very, 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 very pro-French elite, and then a very, very anti-French, very militant working class that has never really had their interests represented by the Senegalese state. And so I mean, it's I think this is what makes Senegal a bit different from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. All countries have this kind of class division to some extent, but not to the level of Senegal, where it's Senegal just has a lot of this very small class that really, really holds on to this French identity. And then the rest of the Senegalese people just so strongly disagree and are waging this struggle. And I think it's for this reason, I think it's going to be a little harder for Senegal to actually get a very anti-imperialist leader in power compared to Burkina, Mali, and Niger. I think there will be a more pronounced struggle in Senegal to get to that place, potentially, because of how strong that ideological divide is. If you look at France, for example, they're constantly giving these awards, literary prizes, artistic awards to these Africans. And it's very often a Senegalese novelist or something that will win some grand prize in France. And then their speech will be about how important it is, to represent la francophonie, which francophonie is this French language / geopolitical alignment with France. They give these speeches about, representing both France and Senegal in this kind of way. There's this class of people that have this kind of position, and they have a stronghold on the country. So I think we shouldn't expect Senegal to have a struggle as easily, potentially, as Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. But like I said, I do think it's a country where on the level of the actual working people, there is such a strong anti-imperialist consciousness. So I think it'll be interesting how this plays out. And I want people to just keep in mind the way that Diomaye Faye came to power after this whole struggle with Sonko is very, very similar to how Macky Sall came to power when Macky Sall was contesting against Abdoulaye Wade, who was the president prior to Macky Sall. So maybe I should give some more context. Macky Sall was this very, very staunchly pro-French president in his sort of economic policy that predated Diomaye Faye, came right before Diomaye Faye. And there was a struggle that actually was waged to get Macky Sall into power. So Macky Sall, there's a film you can watch about this. I think I'm going to look at the name and get back to you in a second, but there's a film you can watch about this, a documentary, which is depicting Macky Sall as this great leader who's going to save Senegal's democracy from the prior president, Abdoulaye Wade. And there was this big, massive set of protests across the country that was trying to get Macky Sall into power. And then Macky Sall turns out to be pro-French. And then it's we're almost repeating another cycle again, which was built on the similar premise of we need to protect Senegal's democracy. Massive struggle then to get Diomaye Faye into power. And then he turns out also to have the same line. So I think it's a time for people to really begin to reflect maybe on what needs to be done beyond just the question of, okay, we are Senegalese people who need to defend this constitution. We're different from the other African countries in that we've never had a coup, and start to think about what kind of strategy we can develop maybe, outside of that framework, because I do think that there's just so much in Senegal in terms of real class struggle and an interest in overthrowing that kind of pro-French line. But we've been going for the past couple rounds now through these cyclical uprisings that get really lost in this rhetoric of now electoral democracy and constitution, and having that anti-imperialist aspect kind of begin to fade into the background. So I'll stop there. I know I have a lot to say.
No, I think that level of context is needed, right? Understanding, the history of Senegal and France's relationships, I think is important. I think, some would see that as a reason to continue, right? Where some people say, you never know what agreements were in place. As I mentioned, some of the folks that, that I had spoken to and what you had discussed about folks that are in, I think that there's the kind of that class divide, those folks that, that are fielding excuses, I guess, for the government participating and working with, the French and the West, as opposed to, or Western allies, as opposed to working more with the Sahel region. I think in that level of context, it's important to understand that, it at least gives context to where we are and what we've seen, and the disappointment the Senegalese have felt previously from different leaders. So I think that all that context is helpful. Now, on that note, I know you did some additional reporting, and the question that we were asking is, did Senegal's anti-France leaders do a U-turn? So Diomaye Faye, 44, as we said, he's 44 years old, was sworn into office on the 2nd of April as Senegal's newest and youngest president. As we mentioned before, his rise to power followed several years of protest against French imperialism and former President Macky, his attempts to consolidate power for his own party. So, Sonko was originally the beloved candidate of Senegal's youth and working class majority. He built an election campaign centered on delinking Senegal from its former colonizer by rejecting the French-controlled CFA or CFA franc currency. Now, over time, the focus of the 50-year-old's campaign gradually seemed to shift from anti-imperialism to pro-electoral and constitutional democracy geared at getting Sall out. When authorities barred him from from contesting in the election, Sonko then encouraged his supporters to vote for his protege, Diomaye Faye, who captured who catapulted to popularity. But did Sonko and Diomaye Faye abandon their anti-imperialist line? As Senegal's newest president, his international visits were met with pro-Western leaders. Well, he met with pro-Western leaders such as the leaders of Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and Ghana, as you mentioned previously. And his first visit outside of Africa, as you also mentioned, was to France, where he met obviously with Macron. So eventually, he then went to the AES after all of that. And so, let's jump to this video where you did some reporting on this topic, and then I'd love to get some additional context and thoughts from you on the other side.
Wild when Senegal's new president was elected a few months ago on a bid to stop using the CFA franc currency. But is Bassirou Diomaye Faye making a U-turn on his campaign promises?
Je ne peux pas dire quand ça va se faire à telle date parce que même les modifications qui interviennent dans les relations entre pays doivent être, de mon point de vue, discutées en toute sérénité, en toute amicalité, en toute amitié. Je ne pense pas qu'on ait besoin aujourd'hui, quel que soit le partenaire, d'avoir des ruptures brutales.
Let's backtrack a bit. On 30 May, Diomaye Faye met with Burkina Faso President Ibrahim Traoré. His message? Senegal would not join the Alliance of Sahel States, known as the AES. That's a confederation recently established by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger to share a policy on defense, economic, and foreign affairs. Diomaye Faye wanted to know if Burkina Faso would consider rejoining the Economic Community of West African States. or ECOWAS. But do people within the alliance's borders want that?
De continuer dans le sens là. On ne veut pas la CEDEAO. On ne veut rien de la CEDEAO. La CEDEAO n'a qu'à aller. L'AES là, qu'on vient de créer.
And how did the other AES leaders respond to Diomaye Faye's proposal?
There are ECOWAS countries that would probably like to join the AES because within the AES, there is a culture of sovereignty and dignity for the continent.
More than a year ago, when Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko was still an opposition figure, he made this comment.
On a été dépeint comme étant des anti-français notoires. Nous n'avons rien contre la France. Et ce que je voudrais dire à nos amis africains, c'est de faire très attention sur un certain nombre de questions. Il n'est pas question de remplacer un partenariat qu'on considérait défavorable par un autre qui peut l'être beaucoup plus.
However, Sonko recently visited Mali, where he promised Senegal would not be used as a base to destabilize Mali. And what do the people in the AES think?
Dans les jours à venir, les pays de l'AES puissent rejoindre, les pays de la CEDEAO puissent rejoindre l'AES, comme a dit le Premier ministre de l'État du Niger. Et après cela, que les autres pays africains aussi soient intéressés par cette alliance afin que l'unité africaine soit une réalité.
Now here's the question for you. Do you think Senegal's new leadership is bending towards France, or are they Pan-Africanists pushing Africa towards greater sovereignty? Let us know in the comments.
All right, so you posed the question to the folks. I want to pose that question to you, right? What are your thoughts there? I mean, obviously, I think it's pretty obvious, but if you want to give initial more context to the discussions you were having on the ground, and just your overall thoughts as to everything that we've seen over the last few months.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like, there was a lot of hope when Diomaye Faye came to power, and some of it was a little confusing, to be honest. Like, one thing I found bizarre when he first came to power was that there were a lot of Pan-African pages that were celebrating Diomaye Faye's election, saying that he'd be a great leader for Africa and for African sovereignty. And then it was BBC was happy, and then France 24 was happy, and they were saying that Diomaye Faye was going to be a great leader for African sovereignty. So there's a little bit of that was a little bit weird already. Why was BBC and France 24 taking the same position as Pan-Africanists? A little bit odd, right? You'd think that those interests would contradict each other. But I do feel like, there's a number of signs and things that we can look to in terms of what kind of leader Diomaye Faye, is and is going to be. I think we see a lot of comments, our comments are saying things like we shouldn't be judging people by their words. We need to be judging people by their actions, right? I think we need to have a barometer or a litmus test. There needs to be a basic minimum that you're able to do that in order to be considered a Pan-Africanist, in order to be considered an anti-imperialist. And I think that the AES, like I said, has set the bar a bit high. So I think for a country like Senegal, at this point, the litmus test, the barometer should be expelling the French military, right? We have 3 neighboring countries that have done that. So if there was ever a time for Senegal to do it, this is the best window of opportunity, right? This is the easiest window of opportunity that Senegal has ever had to make that move. So that's I think the basic barometer at this point is you have to get the military out. And then it's you have to join the AES, being in ECOWAS when there's an anti-imperialist alliance that's forming in 3 countries and you're right there on the border. It's just such an obvious move. And so to be blatantly saying I'm not doing that, I think already is a huge a signal in terms of what Diomaye Faye is about. And the fact also that when Diomaye Faye approached Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, and said that Senegal would not join the AES, but that the AES countries should come back to ECOWAS, that was the explicit demand of Bola Tinubu. Bola Tinubu, when he met with Diomaye Faye, sent Diomaye Faye over to Burkina to pass that message along. So I do find it very odd that Diomaye Faye basically accepted to be a messenger on behalf of Bola Tinubu, and basically to carry out Bola Tinubu's sort of interregional foreign policy plan of action. That is already something very strange. The interview where Ousmane Sonko, again, the Prime Minister of Senegal, is speaking in this video, that was a France 24 interview that he did early last year in 2023. And I'll just say personally for me, that was the moment I was a little bit nervous because I know a lot of people said, we need to take a step back. We shouldn't rush, because oftentimes politicians will keep things on the DL, like on the down low, in terms of what their actual plans will be. Like Traoré didn't come out right away and say, I'm an anti-imperialist, I'm going to get rid of France. There was a few months, there was like a waiting period. I'd say from like the September 30th when he came to power up until around January of the next year, 2024. Personally, I, as well as some of the people around me, we're kind of holding our breaths. We didn't want to rush to make a judgment of him, because things were still very unclear. But it was when he expelled the French military troops in January 2024 that things became more clear. But I think even when things were a little bit more obscure in terms of what direction Traoré was going to take, we didn't see things like France 24 inviting him to come onto their platform. And he certainly wouldn't have said the things that I think Sonko said. I think, Sonko going on a platform like France 24 and basically announcing that France has nothing to lose if he were to win, that he wants to warn the other African countries that are switching. Explicitly, the question was, how do you feel about other African countries that are working with Russia? And Sonko said, we want to warn these African countries about not aligning with another colonial power. That's exactly what France 24's line is. That's their position. And so for him to come on the platform and basically regurgitate France 24's major talking point in terms of foreign policy right now, it was a little concerning. And then now we're seeing other things. It's no longer just Senegal taking things a slow approach. We're waiting to see how he's going to move. We have Diomaye Faye again explicitly talking to the Prime Minister of Spain and actually asking for even more European intervention within the Sahel, saying that they want even more European partnership in the fight against terrorism. It's very alarming. That's not really that's no longer something where it's he's being passive until he can find the right moment to pronounce his politic. He's actually now being very active in trying to pretty overtly develop and strengthen these kind of alignments and connections with Europe. So I think all of these things are very alarming. Again, I think Senegal is still trying to be the nicer ECOWAS country. He did make a statement about how Senegal will not be used to destabilize Mali. There's been this attempt to really be nice to the AES states to their face. It's not like they're trying to say Senegal doesn't seem to be taking the position of we're going to call for sanctions or we would back an ECOWAS invasion. But I do think it's part of a strategic shift that the entire ECOWAS bloc seems to be supporting and actually calling for on behalf of Senegal. Senegal, can you play this intermediary type of role to try to get the AES countries back into our bloc? So I think it's a strategy that Senegal is doing in connection with the other ECOWAS states, which is why Bola Tinubu was the first to kind of call him to do that. So it is still neo-colonial. It is still pro-West. It's just a different tactic. And in some ways, it may be a more dangerous one, because at least Bola Tinubu, we know where he stands. Nana Akufo-Addo, we know very clearly where he stands. Alassane Ouattara, so these are presidents of Nigeria, Ghana, and Alassane Ouattara is president of Cote d'Ivoire. We know where they stand because they take very blatant, bold positions against the AES. Senegal is now the country that's again, their actions and their words don't match, because they're we'll say nice things to you, but we're not going to join you. And we want to, expand relations with the West in practice, but we might say an occasional anti-imperialist thing, more so in theory. So I think that we're on kind of a dangerous terrain with the way Senegal is behaving. And, again, the standard right now, if you're a leader in West Africa, the standard has to be, your position in terms of joining the AES and expelling Western military bases. You're either for it or you're not. And I think it's become that simple and within this new context of the region. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I think that one of the interesting points that you made there was two things, right? One, the warning to folks partnering with non-Western allies, and then also the reassurance that France has nothing to worry about. I think right at the end of the campaigning, I think are signs or were signs that there was going to be a shift. I mean, if you made those statements right before you end up taking on this role, I think that kind of foreshadowed what we are now seeing. And so, you know, it's really interesting to see how, you know, that shift in rhetoric led to what looks like a shift in policy. And, you know, in the meetings that have been, the subsequent meetings that have been happening, kind of seem to align with that shift in rhetoric. It's unfortunate because it seems like there obviously so many people are disappointed by these changes. And, you know, I hope that we see, as you mentioned, potentially there are some things that are happening behind the scenes that maybe they, you know, strategically decided not to talk about publicly, that will lead to stronger alliances, at least to have lesser dependence on the West, as opposed to increasing dependence and potentially increasing what ends up looking like and ends up actually being in practical use and action, more like neo-colonial, I guess, partnerships and relationships. Shifting gears a bit, because I know that we've talked about Senegal at length, and that's what everyone came here for. There are some other news stories around the continent that we did want to review and address and make sure that we did talk about today. And I know that, you know, we are running low on time, but we did want to do a couple of quick updates for you all from the conversations we had just a couple of weeks ago on Afrophobia, right? It was a phrase that is used a ton in South Africa for those folks that are Pan-Africanists, as opposed to xenophobia, because as we discussed, there were, specifically in the Miss South Africa pageant, I think that there was a lot of hypocrisies there, right? We saw what we could pretty much determine is likely a French descendant who won for the Miss South Africa pageant with very little pushback, but obviously someone with some Nigerian connection was basically forced to leave based on a lot of rhetoric and her online harassment. But before we even talk about that specific pageant, we do want to kind of talk about some of the myths that fuel xenophobia or Afrophobia in South Africa. So these incidents have become almost a daily occurrence in South Africa, from inflammatory anti-immigrant rhetoric to physical attacks. Other African immigrants are among those targeted most, with many describing the trend as Afrophobia, as we mentioned. It's fueled by false claims about the floods of foreigners propagated by politicians and sections of the media. So some folks from African Stream actually broke down some of the myths and how they scapegoat immigrants for the social and economic challenges facing the country. So we'll jump to that video and have some commentary on the other side.
Phobic sentiment that has been simmering for years, if not decades. 23-year-old model Chidima Adesina pulled out just days before the final, following weeks of online abuse over claims she wasn't South African enough. Xenophobia in South Africa is not a new phenomenon. Cases have been recorded as far back as the mid-1990s. According to Xenowatch, which tracks xenophobic incidents, 574 people have been killed in 1,100 attacks since the end of apartheid in 1994. What has changed, however, is that xenophobic sentiment has entered the mainstream. This is not by accident, but a result of years of hateful rhetoric spewed by many, including politicians and the media. And most of it is anchored on a number of misconceptions about immigrants. The first is the number of foreigners in the country. While it's true, a lot of people from across the continent have moved to South Africa since the fall of apartheid, numbers are often exaggerated by politicians and the media. They use terms like floods of immigrants, creating the impression that foreigners are taking over the country. Last year, a now deleted ex-post by Marcia Baron, a member of the right-leaning party Action SA, claimed there were 15 million undocumented immigrants in South Africa. The party's leader, Herman Mashaba, made similar claims in 2020 before U-turning when he couldn't back them up. Such statements fuel fears about immigration, and it does have an impact. A survey by the country's Human Science Research Council, HSRC, in 2021 revealed that 48% of South Africans thought that as many as 40 million immigrants were living in the country. In reality, the figures are way lower. According to the 2022 census, only 2.4 million of the 62 million people living in South Africa are foreigners. That's just under 4% of the total population. It means South Africa doesn't even make the world's top 20 countries with the highest number of foreigners. The second claim is African immigrants cause high unemployment rates because they steal jobs from citizens. Clearly, lack of work is a major problem, with the unemployment rate currently at 32.9%, but are foreigners to blame? Hardly. According to Stats SA, in 2019, immigrants made up only 5.3% of the country's formal labor force. The real reason is the country's economy has stagnated in the last decade, and very few jobs have been created. Between 2012 and 2022, annual GDP growth averaged only 0.8%. The downturn has been accompanied by a shift from mining and manufacturing to a service-oriented economy. That has seen a significant drop in the number of people working in the two traditional sectors. For instance, in 1987, the mining industry employed more than 827,000 people. By 2023, that number had almost halved, according to the Minerals Council of South Africa. This trend has also affected other labor-intensive industries, hence leaving millions without jobs. The third claim is that foreigners are behind the country's alarming crime rate. South Africa is by any standards a very violent country. According to the South African Police Service, SAPS, more than 27,000 murders were recorded between April 2022 and April 2023. Over 42,000 incidents of rape were reported during the same period. So, there is a genuine reason for people to be concerned about crime. But again, I'll ask the same question. Are immigrants behind these horrific numbers? A 2016 HSRC survey found 2/3 of South Africans do blame foreigners. Facts, however, disprove that belief. In September 2022, the then police minister, Bekitele, stated only around 3% of the country's inmates are foreign nationals. In fact, over the last few months, 82% of suspects arrested for serious crimes were South African. That's according to the country's Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation, DPCI. A similar report by the Pretoria-based Institute of Security Studies, ISS, shows that between 2017 and 2021, undocumented immigrants only made up 2.3% of people detained for crimes. Of course, South Africans are right worried about the high levels of criminality and unemployment. However, foreigners are not the cause, and xenophobia is not the answer. This only deflects, perhaps, from the main reason: the failure of successive post-apartheid governments to dismantle structures which keep the bulk of the nation's wealth in the hands of the white minority and the small black elite.
Okay, quickly before we get your commentary, Inem, I do want to mention to folks, if you are watching along on Instagram, Instagram will likely be cutting this live stream short. So if you'd like to continue to follow along with this discussion, you will want to jump over to the YouTube channels or the Facebook pages where we are also live streaming. So both Authentic African and African Stream are live streaming across all other platforms. So you can go to X for African Stream and Facebook and YouTube. And then for Authentic African, you can head over to Facebook and YouTube. If you are subscribers or followers of each of those platforms, just go there to continue the discussion. Now, with that, you know, obviously there were a lot of statistics that were really important to help people understand why this rhetoric coming from the political elite is just kind of tactics to make sure that There's still a crab in a barrel mentality that Africans are fighting Africans as opposed to fighting the elite. I'd love to get your thoughts on these stats so eloquently put. It kind of really illustrates how incorrect the people on the ground are who believe in these Afrophobic tropes and who continue to perpetuate them, and who are even sometimes in the comments, as you and I have discussed previously, how wrong they are. So I'd love to get your thoughts on the contents of that video and other contexts that being here on the continent and being one who's been reporting on these kinds of stories.
Yeah, I mean, to begin with, I don't even believe that African people can be immigrants or foreigners in Africa. I mean, if you are from Africa, then you belong to Africa. I would never say to a South African here in Burkina Faso that they're an immigrant or a foreigner. And I don't think that the average person around me here in Burkina Faso would consider another African to be an immigrant or a foreigner. I think the core of the problem in South Africa has nothing to do with other African people who are cut off from South Africa from these colonial borders. I think it has everything to do with settler colonialism. I think every country that is a settler colony has some sort of sickness in the society up until that settler colonial relationship is thoroughly addressed. When we talk about the crime rate in South Africa, we need to consider South Africa is ranked, according to the World Bank, as the most unequal country in the entire world. There is no country, according to these statistics, and there's a statistic or a measurement known as the Gini index that measures wealth inequality in a country. There's no country by that measurement that is more unequal than South Africa, and it's largely on racial lines. So I think when we look at things like high crime rates, look at things like poverty, unemployment, I mean, the first question at the heart of it, is that not the question of this inequality, like this blatant inequality that is like the highest rate on the entire planet and is a direct product of settler colonialism, which is reflected again in the racial aspects and disparities that exist along these unequal lines. So I just think there's a lot of scapegoating. I think it should be clear what the bigger picture is. I mean, and it's like, even if we don't agree on the level of South Africa, just look at the entire planet Earth. I mean, look at literally every single settler colony on the planet. It seems like every settler colony I can think of, the United States, Canada, Australia, indigenous people don't seem to have it very well there. Like all of these indigenous people, Palestine as well, all the people who were there first before the colonizers came and built their like communities on top of those stolen indigenous lands, the indigenous people don't seem to be faring very well in all of them. So I don't really understand this idea that South Africa is some sort of exception where the settlers, this imaginary idea that actually the issue is not the settlers. We have no problem actually with this settler colonial relationship, this issue that existed on these racial lines. That's not the issue. It's actually other Africans. I just think it's preposterous. It doesn't make any sense. Somebody said it's kind of similar to the United States, and I guess it is in a way. I mean, you could make an argument for that parallel that, the Mexicans, for example, Donald Trump wants to build the wall. Kamala Harris is not that better. They're all want to be tough and cracking down. You could argue that they have a stronger indigenous claim to that land than the vast majority of people who live in the United States. That border crossed those people. It wasn't them that crossed the border first. It's the same thing out here. I think we see this with settler colonies. And so it doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense to me that we would just ignore the elephant in the room when it's like the World Bank, which is not even our friend. When does the World Bank ever take the position of Africans? And even they are like, we cannot deny that South Africa has a racial wealth disparity that is so bad that it is set apart from every other country on the planet. And you know what the number 2 country is, if I'm recalling correctly? I mean, it was at least number 2 at one point. I don't know if it's shifted recently, but as far as I know, number 2 country, Namibia. And you know what? Where Namibia is, it borders South Africa. Do you know what Namibia's history looks like? Apartheid. right? Settler colonialism. So I don't know. There's this idea of this like South African exceptionalism that again, I think it's a specific amount of people in South Africa. At least I hope so. I choose to believe that this is something that is very much inflated by a lot of. For one, it's inflated by the settlers. They profit from it. You know, the ruling classes make a lot. Benefit a lot from misplaced conflicts and tensions. But for those who buy into this narrative, it's like, I don't understand the South African exceptionalism. Then you literally have countries that share a border with you and that have the same direct struggles with you, and then you want to act like it's like there's something that's very, very unique and different about your country, and it's the immigrants. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. I think that there's so much beyond that we have to look at. Let's broaden our perspective and see that all the settler colonies seem to be having the same problem. So why don't we look at that?
Well put. And I mean, you mentioned it. There's this idea of the colonizers taking over the rhetoric and changing the way that some folks who are indigenous see or consider themselves indigenous see other groups, right? Because you have the foundational Black Americans, you have many groups in America who consider themselves more indigenous folks because a lot of them, will say that they've come, through sailing earlier in history, and those folks are also folks who would say in a lot of cases that they do not want to see, what they consider quote unquote open borders, right? Even though, Mexico was Texas and California at one point in time, less than 150 years ago, whatever the time frame was. And so, all of that I think is really interesting, and how they control the narrative, and it seems to be kind of, finding its way through to all levels of society. It's actually scary to see how people are responding to folks who are migrating around the continent. And as you mentioned, these borders are colonial borders, right? They are artificial borders that were created by colonizers and folks who did not know the land or the people. So in any case, there are more stories here, so I think we'll just cover maybe one or two more, and we won't have the opportunity to go into some of the other things happening in Kenya, so we will likely save that for next week. So for those of you looking to hear about those stories, come back next week. But we do want to talk a little bit more about the kind of how this played out in the Miss South Africa and Miss Nigeria pageants that happened over the last couple of weeks. I think it's interesting because these are popular pageants that tend to be really popular amongst a certain group of people, but it ended up being kind of a microcosm of a larger issue, right? And we see it playing out in real time. And so that's the reason why we're covering something like the Miss South Africa pageant. And we want to kind of give you guys an update to what happened here because we think it's interesting considering what has transpired. So as you guys might remember, we reported on the fact that a model was forced to pull out of the Miss South Africa pageant after Afrophobic abuse had set, and so she set her sights on the Miss Universe Nigeria. So Miss Universe South Africa, she left. Miss Universe Nigeria is where she entered. She quit the pageant in Pretoria following the backlash and made claims that she wasn't South African enough. Even though she was born in the country and eligible to compete, she faced online abuse over her Nigerian father and mother who had Mozambican roots. So she ended up moving into the Nigerian pageant, and she just talked a little bit about what her experience was. So we could jump to that video to kind of hear a little bit more of from her own words what had happened, and then we'll have some thoughts, some commentary on the other side.
Easy experience. It was really tough. There would be times where I wouldn't even feel like going outside, and I would really cry myself to sleep because I don't think that anybody deserves the kind of backlash that I have received. And I know that I've grown through everything. I've bounced back from all these challenges and obstacles, and it has just really proved the strength and the courage and the resilience that I have. So obviously I'm advocating for unity. I think my story is a very powerful story, and it can be very impactful because this is a lot of people that are not accepted, a lot of people that are still fighting for their identity, and I just feel like in order for us to move better and have a better future, we need to stand together as one. And I know that this is a very great platform for me to use and bringing all of us together as one as Africans.
So interestingly enough, I think, I'm not too sure what her original platform was, but I think she was kind of forced into a new platform. And this platform, I think, is one that is obviously very well needed, and it needs to be represented in multiple ways. So if one of the ways it plays out is in this space, I think that's helpful towards a broader cause, even if it may seem trivial to some. But I'd love to get your thoughts, Inem, on her entering the Miss Nigeria pageant. Her platform now is on unity, and kind of the broader, what seems like implications now that this is played out into spaces that are not just kind of the political sphere, but even in the realms of entertainment as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some interesting conversations in our comments about the power of media. And, I do feel like this story, we've covered it so much on our channel. And it's like, on the one hand, it's like, why focus so much on this like beauty pageant? But I feel like the media in general has really used this to push xenophobia and to push this sort of on the one hand, to spur like more conversations around like xenophobia and Afrophobia, if you prefer. We talked about that during one of our previous episodes that you can check out. The one where we covered this pageant in more detail is a great one to look at because we have a guest from South Africa. But I think at the same time, you mentioned something that also I think is very interesting here. You talked about how this parallels some of the FBA and ADOS sort of conversation in the United States. And, this idea, like there's an idea of like South African exceptionalism. There's an idea of American exceptionalism generally that unfortunately a lot of African people have bought into. But I think we see this kind of division like all over the place. Like I would even point to maybe a country like the Dominican Republic in terms of how it constructs its identity next to Haiti, in opposition to Haiti and not being like the other Africans or the other Black people. And I think, again, it's a question of, Pan-Africanism versus these divide and rule, divide and conquer tactics. One of the commenters said that, probably only 20% of South Africa buys into this Afrophobic rhetoric. And perhaps that's true. That very may well be the reality. So I think on the one hand, it's like the movement is probably gaining traction from the way that, some of this is being covered. And then also like the actual extent to which this is an issue may be inflating, may also be exaggerated. But clearly we see, like in the case of this competition, it had an impact on at least this individual's life, and it has had an impact on the lives of other Africans who do live in the country. So, I mean, I don't know. I just look at these parallels with the United States, with the Dominican Republic. If it's not that we are being encouraged or pushed towards having sort of conflicts on ethnic levels, then we're being pushed or encouraged to have conflicts on religious levels. And if it's not on religious levels, then it's on these micro-nationalist colonial boundaries, these countries that we're putting against each other. It's, again, it's all divide and rule. And it's like every single struggle, if you look at it as, African people, wherever we are, it just seems like whatever the issue is, it always comes down to this idea that we're not able to focus on the bigger picture, which is, again, the imperialist, right? The colonizer, to this day, it remains Western Europe, North America, the countries that are in NATO, those are colonizing us all collectively. And as settlers, wherever they are, instead of focusing on this bigger issue, we focus on like every other little issue we can find between and amongst ourselves. So, I think Miss Nigeria, I'm glad that they took her on. I think that's great. But I think that there is still like deeper struggles that we need to be able to work on, maybe on an ideological level, in terms of getting things sorted out, in terms of clarifying who we are, what our identity is, how it's even possible for us to be focused on these inner African conflicts and not focused on the colonizer.
Well put. I don't really have much to add there. I think what we can do is we can close this out with one final video. And that's just really, kind of talking about, her being crowned Miss Universe Nigeria, and, obviously accepting the last minute invite to compete in Lagos after pulling out of Miss South Africa over this abuse. And, and what this new platform looks like for her. So let's just jump to that video and we'll have some more commentary on the other side. So there you go. Obviously, there's a lot of online chatter. There are some folks who believe it was just given to her, considering the circumstances. That it was largely symbolic. However, it does seem as though it is an opportunity to continue this conversation and bring it to the forefront, because it is an important one. There are all kinds of subsequent things happening with ride-sharing apps, et cetera, that we don't really have time to go into today. But drawing this kind of live stream to a close, any thoughts on this topic in general? Because I think that it's one that deserves time. I know we are running out of time for today, but any additional thoughts here before we bring this live stream to a close on this topic and everything else we've talked about today?
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, so around the time of the Olympics that just passed, African Stream made a post about what it would have looked like if Africa were to compete as the United States of Africa, this unified Pan-African state that Pan-Africanists have been fighting for generations. Some people were very shocked. Like, what are you talking about? Like, Africa couldn't compete as one country in the Olympics. Like, that's absurd. I don't think people understand what Pan-Africanism is. But Pan-Africanism, since the 19th century, has been about unifying Africa into a giant Pan-African state that represents the interests of all African people. So I have to conclude with thinking about what it looks like. We have now African countries that are going to compete in this beauty pageant. And, sure, even in a unified Africa, perhaps there'd be different states that would compete. But I don't know. It also makes me think of, like, what if Africa in all of these sort of global competitions was competing collectively? Again, I just feel like it comes down to this idea of, like, the borders just being so nonsensical. They don't make any sense. There's no reason why South Africa would be in a competition against Mozambique, against, Namibia, against Botswana, or even necessarily against Nigeria if it wasn't for this particular colonial history. So, I think it's great that she won, but I also, I look forward to a day when we just change and shift a bit in terms of how we are constructing our national identity. One person is saying that Pan-Africanism is outdated. Not here. Not where I am. I'm in the Alliance of Sahel States. Pan-Africanism has never been hotter and more alive where I am in Burkina Faso than it is now. Maybe during the Sankara 80s, but since that time, there has not been a more dynamic and vibrant Pan-African movement in this region than what we're seeing today. So it is the times that we're in, right? If we were to have, for example, a beauty pageant, and it was supposed to be like Burkina competing against Mali, overwhelmingly, I just, people would be crying about how it's one AES and, we're one country and, Africa needs to unite. And it's not just the 3 countries. We're talking about a unified African state. That's the struggle in Burkina, where I am. That's the struggle in Mali. That's the struggle in Niger. And it should be the struggle across this continent. So I think we just really have to rethink our frameworks of identity. We really have to get out of this micronational mindset. We are past, we're past this. I think, we're moving past it. And so, hopefully that becomes a lesson of this whole pageant and the whole competition. And we can think about what it means in the future to not be framing things in sort of this way. That's my last word. And I guess just on this subject, check out the other video. I feel like we talked about the pageant, but it wasn't just about the pageant. It was a lot more about South African politics, the ANC, the coalition the ANC is forming with the DA. We talked about the politics of settler colonialism. We talked about the Freedom Charter. So check out that other episode if you want more perspectives on South Africa. And again, we had somebody we interviewed for that. So that would be definitely a cool one to check out.
Agreed. And each and every week, we are reporting on the stories on the continent. Inem does a great job of giving context to, the historical things that have happened along the way that lead to where we are today. And everything is through the Pan-African lens, right? So, as Inem just eloquently put, it is alive and well on the continent. And if you watch any of our live streams, there are many news stories that we discuss here where Inem is talking to folks on the ground, and this is the what you're hearing. And not only do you hear it in the AES, but we've also heard it in a lot of the protests in Kenya as well, and even heard it from people in Nigeria, right? And also the folks in Senegal as well. So it is clearly it is something that started some time ago, but definitely is not outdated. There are folks who believe strongly in it, and are working towards that. And that's what these live streams are about. These are 2 platforms coming together to talk about these topics because we are aligned in that belief system. So if you guys all are interested in stories through that lens, that is what this is about. And so we appreciate you all joining. I appreciate you, Inem, for bringing the wealth of knowledge. Inem did breeze past this quickly, but she did actually live in Senegal. Part of her, I interviewed her on my channel, and I think some portion of, her political awakening happened while there, right? I think, there were many things that happened along the way. But for those of you who are unaware, I think it was interesting for me to hear that story. You guys want to check that out, you can. But it really helps to understand that context because obviously Inem comes with a wealth of knowledge, dates, figures, facts. So indisputable facts, right? Every time we have a live stream, there is something to be learned. And so we will be doing this every Tuesday, and we will be talking about this week's news as much as possible. We will try to cover as broad a topics as we can, and we will continue to have the conversation through the lens of Pan-Africanism. So thanks again, all of you guys, for watching. If you haven't already, subscribe to both channels on YouTube. That really helps to ensure that you guys are up to date with every new video and post that we're putting out. We also recommend that you share this with some friends of yours, people that who need this kind of insight and information and context for what's happening on the continent. And lastly, we ask that you hit that thumbs up. If you found this interesting, hit that like button because then that allows the algorithm to show it to more people, and this continues to be a spread to folks who need to have this knowledge. And so with that, guys, thanks for watching. We will see you all again next week.